Bruce Stokes, welcome back.
Thank you.
Are a busy guy. You just came back from Europe, and you're talking to the Europeans about what they think about the world. And as I read the results about how Europeans face the world divided, the Europeans are divided facing the world. So I see things that they talk about in their own countries being perhaps interested in more national autonomy, and at the same time, they say, yeah, but we want Europe to be something. So explain to me the but. I know that people can carry two thoughts in their minds at the same time, but what did you see? It seemed like they wanted to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, there is a real paradox. I mean, we probably shouldn't be surprised. I mean, basically, at this moment in time, Europeans are inward looking. They're more likely to say we want our country to take care of its own problems and let the world deal with its own problems, rather than saying, well, we'd really like to help the world deal with their problems. A majority of the Germans want to help the world deal with their problems, but the median in the rest of Europe is not there. And basically, when we ask people about their country's foreign policy, they're much more likely to say, well, we should take care of our own national interests, and whatever our allies think, it's not that we should believe in our allies and kind of listen to them when they ask us about our foreign policy. Except, again, the Germans tend to say we need to deal with we need to take into what our allies are thinking when we make our foreign policy. But so they're inward looking at this moment. I must say it hasn't changed that much. We've been asking this question since 2010, and we can't say they've turned inward, but they've been inward at least since we started asking this question. Now, Americans feel the same way.
Right.
What was striking in this survey was that Americans and Europeans at this moment are both about equally inward looking in terms of how they feel about their place in the world. We then ask people, do you think your country plays a bigger or a lesser role in the world today than it did 10 years ago? 6 in 10 Germans say we play a bigger role, but most people say no, we play a lesser role or no greater role.
Including the U.S.
And what's interesting, in the U.S., 46% of Americans say the United States plays a lesser role today than it did 10 years ago. So when Donald Trump says, make America great, there's a large portion of the American public, a plurality, who say, yes, we think our country's not as great as it used to be.
Yeah.
So that sentiment resonates on both sides of the Atlantic. But what's interesting and paradoxical when you ask the Europeans is you say, how do you feel about the EU? And they say, oh, we're really down on the EU. Favorability's gone down again. It's fairly low. So we're in kind of a double dip in terms of attitudes towards the EU. You ask them how the EU's handling problems. They say, oh, we don't think they've done a good job handling the refugee problem. We don't think they've done a good job handling Russia. We don't think they've done a good job handling the economy. But when you ask them, do you want the EU to play a bigger role on the world stage in the future? Overwhelmingly, everybody says we want the EU to play a bigger role.
Do you, when you ask that question, either in personal terms or whether you look at the stats, do you know what they mean when they say that?
Well, one of the dirty little secrets of polling is they probably don't know what they mean when they say that. Because, people don't lie awake nights kind of thinking, well, if somebody calls me on the phone, how do I feel about the EU in the future? But I do think that we did a question a couple of years ago where we asked the public to give us attributes of the EU. And people said, oh, it's intrusive and it's bureaucratic, but we still believe it brings peace. And actually we believe it brings prosperity. So I think maybe this question about the future role of the EU in the world taps into some of that aspirational quality of the EU. That, yeah, we're kind of down on them today, but we still believe in the ideal of why this whole thing was created in 1957. So there is that paradox.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at it across the scope, obviously it doesn't surprise me to see that the people are really down on Europe or the Greeks. They've gotten battered, and that's understandable. Whereas the Germans, as you just suggested, are still very pro-Europe in comparison with everybody else, and everybody else falls in the middle there. The question is, I guess, we're sitting here talking before the referendum in London. We don't know how that's going to turn out. But one wonders, what kind of a catalyst is going to determine the way people think. Now, you and I have watched watched the immigration crisis, we've seen the economic crisis, we've seen the Crimea crisis, and all of those are catalysts within the way Europeans think about themselves. What I guess I wonder about is that there is this aspiration feeling, and it would be a nice idea. Gandhi used to say, "How do you feel about Western democracy?" And he said it would be a good idea or something like that. But they don't know exactly what's going to happen. And if you have a situation which is rather unpredictable, whether it's the referendum, the Brexit actually happening, and then the economic downturn or the least the volatility that might go with it, let alone any kind of geopolitical situation that might emerge on the eastern border of Europe, you wonder how stable is this? In other words, did you get a sense for the way that Europeans feel? Are they existential at the moment, or is there this do you have a general sense of anxiety?
Well, what is, I think, very illustrative in our survey is in relation to the debate around Brexit. We asked people in all 10 European countries where we surveyed, including 9 of the continental countries, do you want more power to go to Brussels, or do you want more power to come back to your country, or do you want to keep things about the way they are? Which is really the question of, do you want more Europe or less Europe? Which is the underlying debate in the UK. Well, 65% of the Brits said we want more power to come back to London. That's probably not surprising given the fact they're actually having a referendum on this. But what was striking is that a majority or a plurality of people in 4 of the continental 9 countries said, no, we would like more power back to our capital too. And even in the other countries, there was a sizable minority who said we want more power to come back. So it does seem to me, however the British end up voting, the debate about more Europe or less Europe is still there, and will go on.
Yeah, I think so too. The European bureaucracy, or some of the leading lights of Europe in the earlier years, used to use this expression about the evolution of Europe. They said the way is the goal, meaning we just work on it, and it's like the bicycle, and we keep riding it. And yeah, we may not exactly know what the road looks like, but we keep riding it because that's the way we get to the goal. If I read this correctly, I'm seeing people saying, where's the goal? Less than, well, yeah, we'll get there. People are just simply more impatient. They want to figure out whether their own futures and their national futures can have a more special, specific case in saying, when we get here, we've got this. Right now, I read it by Europeans over the many decades that this has been in operation, keep promising Europeans, this is the moral thing to do, this is the right thing to do, no more World War II, this is the great thing to do. And yet they began, I think, many Europeans began to lose sight of, well, where's the beef? What happens here? Even though I think there is a lot of beef, but don't you think that's part of it?
Well, we didn't ask the question this year, but we've asked it for many years in the past. We asked people about the European project, basically.
Right.
Do you think that economic integration of Europe is a good or a bad thing for your country? Now, bear in mind, this is the 1957 proposition. This is why the common market was created in the first place. It was the primary kind of ostensible goal over and above making sure that France and Germany didn't go to war again. But the pathway was through economic integration.
Right.
And what was interesting in past surveys, and in fact it was so prevalent we decided not to ask it again this time, was people basically didn't believe that economic integration was good for their country. So that very fundamental belief seems to have gone away. Now, I think it's fair to assume that this is in part because the economy has been performing so poorly in the past. Now, but what is interesting is that faith in the EU and faith in economic integration is more prevalent among the young than the old. Now, you could have maybe thought it would be the other way around, that older people who kind of grew up on the ideal of Europe in the 50s and 60s.
And remember the war.
And remember the war, or at least they heard it from their parents, so that might have been, but no, they're the ones that seems to have lost the most faith in the EU, whereas younger people still are more likely to be positive about the EU. And even if it's a small positive, in other words, I think it's 30-some% of the Greek young people are in favor. It's still more than the old people. And I do think that that suggests that, well, I guess two things. One is the future of the EU might still be more positive because young people who form these views at a young age are likely to keep them, even in the face of high youth unemployment.
Yeah.
And the other is, I think it's probably just a reflection of the fact that young people came of age when Europe was a fact of life.
Right.
Older people had to get used to the idea, they had to embrace the idea, they had to come to terms with the idea and accept it and support it. But they weren't born into it. Whereas millennials, they came of age after the Cold War. The EU and European immigration, et cetera, that's just a fact of life.
Yeah, and you throw in a couple of other things I find, like, for example, Erasmus.
Yeah.
You know, kids just move around and they're moving around all the time. Okay, well, let's assume for the moment that that does have a more positive spin to this. The thing that I find another factor in here, and you injected into this survey, that there are some parallels here with the U.S. In other words, we're both turning in, we're both concerned, we're both thinking, why do I have to be involved in other people's fires? Why can't they put them out themselves? And so forth. When you had those conversations and you saw all of this and you had in the back of your mind, gee, that's kind of happening in the United States too, one could really come to the conclusion that saying, boy, you know, we're becoming really self-preoccupied on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, if that's correct, then let me ask you, do you see or did you hear more people saying, you know, even if we're down on Europe, we still think we got to get that act together. But on the U.S. side, those guys are going to hell in a handbasket too, and we're not, you know, we're seeing Trump, we're seeing all kinds of things we don't like. How do you evaluate these two kind of self-preoccupying, you know, circles interfacing with each other in the next years?
Well, it is interesting. We have asked Americans whether Europe or Asia is more important to the United States, and for the last 2 years, basically people said, no, it's Europe. It's more important to the United States. There was 1 year, a couple of years ago, where Asia was more important, right after the Asian pivot. So the fear that many European elites have expressed that, oh, America's turning its back on Europe, it's just not borne out by the data. The public believe that currently believe Europe is more important. Now, I must point out, it's young Americans who say Asia is more important. Older Americans say Europe is more important today. So demographically, this could change over time as the older generation passes away. In Europe, we measure every year attitudes towards the United States. They are still fairly positive. I mean, you hear among European elites, oh, there's rising anti-Americanism. Well, it's a question of relativity. As of last year when we did this, yes, attitudes towards the U.S. were down a little bit in many countries. I mean, actually the greatest decline was in Germany. But nevertheless, still half of Germans had a positive view of the United States. And this was higher than at any time during the Bush administration. So, yes, it's down from the sky-high numbers that existed in 2009 or 2010, right after Barack Obama was elected, when he wasn't George Bush. But it's not as if there is this virulent anti-Americanism breaking out in Europe, at least according to our numbers.
I think that one of the things that's changing is that the relevancy factor for ourselves across the Atlantic is in transformation. So we have a narrative that served us so well through the first 40 years or so after World War II. Now we've had 25 years of kind of thinking through what is the ways in which we need each other. I don't think we're finished with that. I don't think we know the answer to that fully. But then comes a situation like a crisis with the economic downturn in 2009, comes a crisis like 214 in the Crimea, comes a crisis like the immigration issue. These are existential. These are challenges in which people immediately try to solidify about what their interests are. And I think that there can't be the same package in the narrative that says that's why we need the United States when the wall was up.
No, look, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, for example, take attitudes towards NATO. Actually, the median attitude towards NATO is more positive in Europe than it is in the United States, although we're both above 50%, but the median in Europe is slightly higher than in the U.S. But when you ask the more practical question about Article 5 in NATO and would you come to the defense of a NATO ally if attacked by Russia, 58% of the Germans said no, a majority of the French said no, a majority of the Italians said no, and only 50% of the British said yes, where as Americans, a majority of Americans say, oh yeah, we go to the defense of a NATO ally. So you're right, on these practical issues, there seems to be disagreement when you get below the surface of the kind of principled issues. And we see the same, I think, around TTIP.
Exactly.
We don't have Europe-wide data on TTIP, but the Eurobarometer does. Support for slipping all over Europe. It's particularly bad in Germany and Austria, but that's in the negative territory. But if you ask a principled question about Americans, Europeans are much more likely to say that economic engagement for their country is good for their country than Americans. 49% of Americans say economic engagement of our country is actually bad for the United States. So we do disagree on that issue, but when you get into the practicalities of it, the European support for a practical transatlantic free trade agreement, we know from the Eurobarometer data, is slipping badly.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to the question: where is the relevancy perceived by a public in 2016 versus 1989? Let me ask you a final question, Bruce. We don't know tomorrow or whenever the Brexit referendum is going to be. The final results are there for us to look at. Let's assume it does happen. What does that do you think, to these questions about the relevancy of Europe for Europeans? And if you wanted to go a little step further and say, what do you think it'll do for transatlantic relations?
Well, I do think it will be a huge challenge for both Europe and for the United States. And at least the people I've talked to in the State Department, there is no plan B. I know in talking to people in Brussels, they negotiated two statements, depending on what the outcome is. We don't have any data on what it means, but I do go back to this point that you've got pluralities or at least significant minorities in almost all of these countries on the continent who say, we would like more power to come back to our country too. Right. So it's not as if this debate is not going to go on. And we know from press reports and other things that there's a movement in Denmark to have a referendum. There's a movement in the Netherlands to have a referendum. Marine Le Pen has asked for a referendum in France. So, there will be a movement there to pull back. And what's interesting is when we have asked people, we've only done this once and only in Germany and only in one issue, we ask people, what would you like to have come back to your country? And we asked the Germans, would you like future trade agreements to be negotiated by Berlin or Brussels? The Germans said Berlin. And bear in mind that Brussels has had the legal power to negotiate trade agreements since 1957. So that's a pretty fundamental return of power to the national capital, at least in that one case.
Yeah. Well, evolutions are, by definition, unpredictable. It seems to me that, there's always some sort of a outside external force that could work its way into this. Look at what happened in Brussels, look in the airport, look at what happened in Paris. And to some extent, I think, the uncertainty around Europe remains. I think the volatility is still going to be there for a while. But that's what I concern myself with. In other words, even after our election on November 8th, all the people that are upset with us here in the United States and the country and in which way we're going, and all the people in Europe after the Brexit and after next year's elections in Europe, the important ones, France, Germany, all of that stuff is still going to be in the air. And I wonder how political leaders are going to be able to deal with that, because regardless of who wins the election in the United States, there's still going to be all of this fundamental blowback. And some president's going to have to deal with that. And in the case of Germany, or in the case of France, or in the case of England, wherever you look, every single political leader is having trouble doing that. And I wonder, in the end, how the volatility or how the ability to shape around common denominators will be possible without some external factor entering in and sobering people up. We don't want to think it would have to be something dramatic like a terrorist attack, but some wake-up call that says, the sum is greater than its parts, people. How do you remember that? How do you put the dialogue back into focus when it's been so polemical in the last, 3 years? There, I think we share something across the Atlantic. I'm always reminded, in a way, you could take a piece from Churchill. What did he used to say? democracy is the worst form of government in comparison with everybody else. And the EU might be the worst form of, international organization, except for everything else. So anyway, let's wish them all the best of luck and see what happens. Next time we'll talk, we'll take it up from there.
Thank you.
Thank
Jack.
you, Bruce.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.